order to understand the greatness of Shakespeare as a writer, one has to see him in his time. Shakespeare was not only, as Ben Jonson called him, a poet for all time, but he was also a poet, a dramatist of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, literally, rebirth, meant going back to some of the values of the classical world. In that classical world, man is considered to be the measure of all things. And so for the Renaissance, and that's one of the primary impetuses for the change in conception, for the foregrounding of the individual in that Renaissance world, where the primary achievement of the medieval world, the architectural achievement, is the Gothic cathedral. When one walks into that space, one feels one's smallness in relationship to God. The Renaissance, however, was turning in a different direction, turning towards man. Think, for example, of Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing of Vitruvian man, arms and legs outstretched. Leonardo calling our attention to the human form, the beauty of the human form, the centrality of the human form. Not only in art, but also in theology, perhaps primarily, there was a shift towards emphasis on the individual. Martin Luther, we remember from our high school classes, in 1517 goes to the church in Wittenberg and nails his 95 Theses to the door. Thus began the Protestant Reformation. Luther is famous for the 95 Theses, which primarily emphasized the importance of individual faith. His two Latin tags, or Latin sayings, sola fides, sola scripturis. Sola fides, by faith alone, by one's faith alone. Sola scripturis, by reading by scriptures alone. If one wants to have a relationship with the divine, with God, one cannot rely upon others, mediators, priests, popes, institutions, traditions, but rather one has to have a relationship with God on one's own, by faith alone. And also during our period, it's a period of translation. Luther is famous, of course, for starting the Reformation, but part of that Reformation was making the Holy Book, the Bible, available in German. He is famous for his translation of the Bible into German and also for his prayer book, which is still in use today. Sola fides, by faith alone, sola scripturis, by reading alone. If you want to have a relationship with God, you need to read on your own his revealed word, not relying upon a priest, a mediator. And of course, during our period, before Luther, the Bible was only available to the elites, that is, in Latin. It's not an accident that the greatest and most famous, although fictional, individual of our period, Hamlet, went to university in the same place that Luther hung up his 95 Theses, that is, at Wittenberg. So there are larger cultural factors at work when Shakespeare is writing, economic ones as well. The rise of capitalism, the emergence of mobility, the sense that individuals, not only on a spiritual level, but on an economic and pragmatic level, can make their own destinies. We have a problem during our era of looking at literature as merely or only a form of entertainment. And some of us even go so far as to reject those who pursue literary interests as artsy, when in fact, literature from Shakespeare through really the 18th century, and of course the great works of the 20th century as well, literature not only entertains, but it deals with the most profound philosophical problems. We will be dealing with, in our lessons, exploring the questions of the relationship between the individual and society. And that question parallels others on the nature of language, the nature of names, and the nature of identity. This is not mere entertainment. We start with one of Shakespeare's earlier plays, and notwithstanding its being an early play, it is one of his most challenging and greatest. Having come from Stratford-upon-Avon to London in the early 1590s, he wrote his play Romeo and Juliet. He would have come to London and seen other great dramatists produce their work on the Renaissance stage. Christopher Marlowe, his famous Dr. Faustus, Ben Jonson, who was Shakespeare's primary competitor in the commercial field of the theater. We all know the story of Romeo and Juliet, the story of the two families, the Montagues and the Capulets, the feud between them, and how Romeo the Montague and Juliet the Capulet fall in love as star-crossed lovers. They are fated from their very beginning to death. Because of the cultural framework in which their love is born, they must meet that early death. Their love, and this is one of the main themes of the play, cannot survive in the social world in which they live. They create a kind of love, a love between individuals, Juliet and Romeo. Juliet really is the prime mover of the story. Their love simply cannot exist, cannot be accommodated in the toxic world of Verona. That world, as we'll see, is toxic for several reasons. Primary among them is the masculine violence that characterizes that world, but also the way in which the feminine is understood and limited and restrained. In some sense, Romeo and Juliet is the story of Juliet's escape from those constraints and her ability to take Romeo along with her and to create a form of love. But that form of love, as we mentioned, cannot be sustained in the cultural context with the social limitations of Verona. Shakespeare is a plagiarist. That perhaps comes as a surprise, but almost every Shakespeare play is based upon a story that he's taking from elsewhere. Romeo and Juliet was a very well-known story during the Renaissance. It was told and retold. Shakespeare's primary source for this was a long poem by a guy named Arthur Brooke, which was a long, boring, moralizing poem where the two lovers from the very beginning are castigated and condemned for their moral decadence and corruption. In this poem, the one by Brooks, their desire is not a sign of healthy individuation, the healthy expression of self, but rather of moral failure. So Shakespeare is a plagiarist. Of course, he's not. Shakespeare takes his precedent source, transforms it, appropriates it, and makes it entirely new. In some sense, Shakespeare helps us understand how earlier generations thought about tradition. Tradition is not going back to a set of dead texts and merely repeating them. Tradition is going back to a text or a set of texts, a set of works that the author, the current author, Shakespeare, makes alive, transforms, and makes present to his contemporary audience. As mentioned, part of the toxic character of Verona was reflected in the ideas about women and marriage. That is, especially the idea of the feminine in relationship to the masculine, or rather the relationship, we can think of it more practically, how a woman functions in the society of the Elizabethan period. In 1562, that's way before Shakespeare, there was a published homily on the state of matrimony, published and republished. It goes as follows. For the woman is a weak creature not endowed with strength and constancy of mind, sooner to be disquieted and upset, prone to weak emotions, light-hearted, and prone to vain fantasies and opinions. The woman here, or the feminine here, is understood in terms of weakness, emotion, imagination, and fantasy. And further on account of disposition, women were granted some power, that is, power in their household, in relationship to their children, but in relationship to their husbands, the homily says they must cease from commanding and perform subjection. She must be obedient. She must perform subjection. A wonderful phrase, really. So the feminine has to perform subjection and not be a subject. In this context, we start to understand the framework for Juliet's maturity in the play Romeo and Juliet. She becomes a subject. To be sure, she is subject to and asked to perform subjection by her lifelong companion, her nurse, by her mother, and by especially her father. But she breaks out of those constraints, and she does so through the language of love. One of the things that we see through Shakespeare, not only in Romeo and Juliet, but through many of his comedies, is that love is the means through which a person expresses or can express her individuality. Drama is a dominant metaphor for Shakespeare, and the strongest characters in Shakespeare's work direct their own dramas or play starring roles within them. But before we see Juliet acting out her part, really directing her play of Juliet and Romeo, we find the young Juliet part of another play. And that's the play that's organized or arranged by her father Capulet. Of course, that play is very real for her, and the title of it is The Marriage of the Young Juliet. Juliet in our play is only 15 years old. His desire for Juliet is that she marry, from his point of view, the most eligible man in Verona. He's referred to, called the County Paris, because Shakespeare wants us to experience him not as an individual, but as a corporate social entity, as opposed to her very real and individual lover, Romeo. One of the distinguishing things about Shakespeare is that even the vulgar scenes, the ones that are there to provide entertainment for those sitting, or rather standing, the groundlings who are standing in the cheap seats, even these scenes are filled with meaning and provide lenses on the rest of the play. In the beginning of the play, Juliet's nurse and sometimes confidant harkens back to the past, remembering her dead husband. "Ah, was a merry man, took up the child," that is Juliet. "Yea," quoth he, now she is quoting her husband. "Yea," quoth he, "dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit, wilt thou not, Jule?" Here, the nurse, hearkening back to the past, the merry man, her husband, is taking up the young child who, in the process of playing, falls upon her face and then makes the very not politically correct joke. "Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit, wilt thou not, Jule?" Here, the husband of the nurse is sexualizing the toddler Juliet, suggesting that though she has fallen on her face as a youth, when she gets older, she'll fall backwards in the sexual embrace of her husband. "The pretty wretch," and now the nurse continues, "left crying and said, I, A-Y, I," which certainly sounds like I. Yes, it's a vulgar joke, Shakespearean locker room talk, the nurse's husband sexualizing the young Juliet. Obedience is not just household chores, and remember, Juliet is only 14 years old at this point. She falls forward as a child, but she will fall backwards, in her marriage bed. And to this, she responds, I. In this play of Juliet as sexual object, even her mother, the Lady Capulet, is made uncomfortable. Juliet says I in pain as she falls forward, anticipating the time she will fall backward. But at the same time, and this anticipates the play that she will share with Romeo, she repeats, I. In Shakespeare's projection of Juliet's unconscious precociousness, we already see the beginnings of her I, herself, Juliet as individual. This statement of Juliet's individuality does not, however, come to the fore immediately. Rather, immediately following this scene, Lady Capulet, note, she has no identity independent of her family name. As wife of Capulet, she asks, "How stands your disposition to be married?" Here we have the constraints upon the feminine. Juliet, who is first sexualized and then made ready for marriage. And then the final ingredient, the incentive. You shall share all that he does possess: sex, marriage, money, feminine identity in Verona. Yet there is also a different drama playing out, one that Juliet begins to direct from her balcony. Everyone knows the famous balcony scene, which begins, "Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" In this scene, we see Juliet and love, and her directing of Romeo, who spends much of the first act writing generic love poetry to the soon-to-be-forgotten Rosalind. Bad poets in Shakespeare's plays make very bad, narcissistic, and selfish lovers. You can tell what kind of lover a person is going to be by the way he speaks. But this scene shows, and we shall come back to it, the extent to which Shakespeare does not merely entertain with a passionate love story, but that poetry for him and for some of his contemporaries and predecessors is a way of exploring the deeper issue of identity and love. Only later in the 17th century, a tradition which we have inherited, is poetry rejected as mere entertainment. For Shakespeare, however, it is that means through which he can explore the most profound human issues. When Romeo comes out of hiding and shows himself, he swears his love to Juliet. Bad poetry alert. "Lady, by yonder blessed moon, I vow that tips with silver all these fruit tree tops." But Juliet will have none of this adolescent poetry that may have worked with Rosalind, it may work with others. "Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon, that monthly changes in her circle orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable." Juliet is not interested in the oaths characteristic of this generic love. Interestingly, during our period, changeable love associated with the moon was associated with the feminine, and here Shakespeare's Juliet is associating that with Romeo. Romeo is perplexed at this point and says, "Well, if I can't swear by the moon, what should I swear by?" To which she responds, "Do not swear at all, or if thou wilt, swear by thy gracious self, which is the god of my idolatry, and I'll believe thee." Here is Shakespeare creating the languages of individualism through love. Juliet calls Romeo, "Yourself is the god of my idolatry. Swear on that, swear on yourself, and I'll believe thee." Juliet to Romeo says, "Don't use the exhausted cliches of bad poets, but more than that, swear on yourself, on your I." Juliet suggests that if Romeo is to be her lover, he will have to focus not on the cliched images of nature. Swear on your gracious self. For Romeo to be a suitable lover, he must also become an I. Shakespeare, however, designs a play, which we've already said, in which the fate of the two lovers, the two selves, who we shall see in our next lesson, they create a private language which is ultimately doomed. From one perspective, they are fated by the drama that they are in. It's a tragedy. It's unavoidable. From another, they are fated by the social world in which they live. They are in a drama, in the end, over which they have no control. Shakespeare emphasizes drama and dramatic form by duping his audience early on into believing that the play will have a happy ending. And indeed, in the first two acts of the play, we seem to be experiencing a comedy. And much of what we experience in seeing Shakespeare's contemporary comedies is present here. Feasting, dancing, the masking and hiding of identity that is so characteristic of Shakespeare's early comedies. In those plays, lovers dress up so that they can reveal their true identities. In some sense, that happens in Romeo and Juliet as well. Romeo and Juliet meet each other as they are masked. Oscar Wilde said famously, "Give a person a mask and let them tell you who they really are." But here in this play, notwithstanding the masking scene, the feasting, Capulet's generosity, and inclusiveness at the party at which Romeo and Juliet meet, he's a good host even to Romeo, by Act 2, the drama has taken a turn towards tragedy. Shakespeare's mature comedies, we will read one of them as you like it, veers towards death, but avoids it. In Romeo and Juliet, their tragedy, Romeo's friend Mercutio is killed by the Capulet Tybalt. At his death, Mercutio proclaims the famous line, "A curse upon both of your houses," as the play spirals into tragedy. This new and transcendent love of Romeo and Juliet, wholly different from that of the sources, in the end cannot be tolerated by the society for whom the traditional homily on marriage was authoritative. Not tolerated, certainly not by Capulet himself. In Juliet's proclamation of disobedience, "I will not marry the County Paris," her commitment to her beloved Romeo, Capulet responds with violence. "Hang thee, young baggage, disobedient wretch, I tell you. Get to church on Thursday, the wedding day, or never, ever after." Hamlet tells Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery." Here Capulet says, "Get to church on Thursday or never after. Look me in the face, speak, not reply. Do not answer me." For the male culture of Verona, which Capulet represents, Juliet must play her part or be silent. Do not reply. Do not answer. In fact, one might say that for Juliet in Verona, the feminine part is to be silent. If she does not play the role of the obedient girl in his play, the one that ends in the not-so-happy ending for Juliet of marriage, she is nothing. Capulet complains of spending his life getting her ready for the proper social match. And he proclaims, in frustration, in anger, with violence, "I'll give you to my friend, and you be not, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets." There is no "me too" in Verona. I'll give you to my friend. Juliet, in this context, nothing more than chattel. Capulet continues, "Graze where you will, you shall not house with me. From object, I'll give you to my friend." Now Juliet becomes an animal. Graze where you will, without any agency. Do as you like, but not in my house. But against those social norms, Juliet does carve out a private language, one she shares with Romeo. But within the confines and constraints, the sexual politics and economics of Verona, within those constraints, their love does not have a future. Shakespeare gives us at the beginning of the play a sense of those constraints, the social constraints, the sexual constraints, the gendered constraints. He gives us the sense of the limitations on the feminine. Remember that injunction from the homily on marriage, perform subjection. We see Juliet in the role of somebody who is meant to perform subjection. But as the play develops, and we'll see this in the coming lessons, Juliet with Romeo develop a transcendent language of love, a transcendent language of individuality by which they both become subjects.